Brazil's public deficit has soared to 10% of GDP, and the Brazilian real has reached its lowest levels in history. What exactly is happening in Lula da Silva's Brazil, and how far can this situation go? Let's analyze it. Since January 1, 2023, Lula da Silva has been the president of Brazil, having replaced Jair Bolsonaro at the head of the Brazilian Republic. One defining characteristic of Lula's presidency has been his staunch opposition to cutting public spending to stabilize the budget balance. The fiscal problem in Brazil is not just that primary expenditures are growing faster than budget revenues, but also that the high interest rates set by Brazil's central bank to combat inflation, currently above 12%, far exceed inflation, which is slightly over 4%. This situation significantly increases the financial cost for the Brazilian government of issuing new debt and refinancing existing debt. For example, according to the latest available data from October 2024, the public deficit over the previous 12 months, from November 2023 to October 2024, amounted to nearly 2% of GDP before interest payments. However, the interest payments on all public sector debt during the same period surpassed 7.5% of GDP. As a result, Brazil's total public deficit for the last 12 months is approximately 9.5% of GDP, and it is projected to end 2024 close to 10%. Just 3 years ago, the situation was very different. The public deficit before interest payments was nearly 0% of GDP, essentially a balanced budget. At the same time, interest payments amounted to about 4.5% of GDP, so the total public deficit hovered around 4.6% or 4.7% of GDP, nowhere near the 10% now anticipated for 2024. This explosive public deficit has placed the Brazilian state in a highly fragile financial position. The more insolvent the Brazilian state appears, the lower the demand for its liabilities. The state's main liabilities are its bonds and its currency, the real. If demand for Brazilian government bonds decreases, the interest rates on those bonds rise, increasing the cost of refinancing public debt. For instance, the interest rate on Brazil's 10-year bond is currently over 14%, the highest level since 2016. Excluding the brief political turmoil in 2016 when Michel Temer replaced Dilma Rousseff, we would have to go back to 2008 to find such high rates for Brazil's 10-year bond. Similarly, lower demand for the real translates into a depreciation of the currency relative to other foreign currencies, especially the dollar. Currently, it takes 6.1 reals to buy a dollar, compared to 2 reals in 2014, 4 reals a few years later, and 5 reals between 2020 and 2023. The real's depreciation has been a long-term trend in Brazil's history, but has accelerated in recent months. If the real has not depreciated further against the dollar, it is because Brazil's central bank has used part of its dollar reserves to stabilize the exchange rate. In recent months, Brazil's international reserves have fallen from $372 billion to $347 billion, a reduction of $25 billion. Despite this, the real has still depreciated to its lowest level ever. While it is not inherently wrong for a central bank to use foreign reserves to stabilize its currency during drastic changes in demand, whether seasonal or speculative, the problem here is that this is not an unfounded speculative attack. There are plenty of reasons for investors to avoid Brazilian state liabilities. Until these underlying issues are resolved, using foreign reserves to stabilize the exchange rate or public debt interest rates only buys time without addressing the core problems. The fundamental issue is fiscal in nature, a budget imbalance and a public deficit of 10% of GDP. If Brazil wants to lower interest rates without triggering a sharp currency depreciation, it must follow Argentina's lead under Javier Milei by balancing its budget. Some argue that the central bank could simply lower interest rates to reduce the cost of public debt, but this approach has a major flaw. If interest rates are lowered without sufficient demand for the real, increasing the supply of reals will only lead to further depreciation. High interest rates currently sustain demand for the real, as investors are attracted by returns of 12 to 14%. Lower rates, combined with an increased money supply, would trigger a steep depreciation of the real. On the other hand, maintaining high interest rates risks pushing Brazil towards insolvency, as the growing debt burden undermines long-term confidence in the real. Investors may anticipate that the central bank will eventually monetize the debt, or that defaults on public debt will erode the value of central bank assets, leading to a loss of confidence in the real. Ultimately, both high interest rates and foreign reserve interventions only buy time. The core problem remains the structural fiscal deficit of the Brazilian state. The solution lies in a determined fiscal adjustment to stabilize public accounts, much like the measures taken by Javier Milei in Argentina. By achieving a significant primary surplus, investor confidence in the state's solvency can be restored, initiating a virtuous cycle. Greater solvency leads to increased demand for state liabilities. Higher demand for bonds reduces interest rates, lowering the debt burden. Increased demand for the real allows lower interest rates without currency depreciation. However, Lula da Silva refuses to implement spending cuts. Despite Brazil's worsening fiscal situation, his government has shown no inclination to make adjustments. This is evident to investors, who are growing increasingly distrustful of Brazilian state liabilities, leading to rising bond yields and a depreciating real. Without decisive fiscal reforms, Brazil risks entering a vicious cycle of currency depreciation, inflation, higher central bank rates, rising public debt costs, and further depreciation, a cycle difficult to break without significant budgetary adjustments. Lula's ideological commitment to a fiscally irresponsible social democracy appears incompatible with the fiscal discipline Brazil urgently needs, leaving the country on a collision course with financial instability.